2000 southern Georgia. The small town of Marble Ridge seemed frozen in the past. It was a typical American settlement, with quiet streets, white houses with porches, and lush flower beds on the lawns. Everyone in town knew each other, and nothing escaped the eyes of the locals. However, what happened one summer day that year turned the town upside down, becoming a legend that would be whispered about for years to come. Claire Matthews was a young beauty raised in the finest traditions of the southern states. Tall, with black hair, soft skin, and bright green eyes, she was the object of admiration for many of the men in town. However, her heart had long belonged to Jack Wilson, a charming and successful guy from a rich family, heir to a big business. They met in high school, and since then have not parted, for all their relationship was the embodiment of perfect love. After 7 years of relationship, when Jack was 25 years old, he decided to make Claire an offer. It happened during their trip to the coast in the small town of Tidewater. On the beach, to the sound of the waves and the soft light of the setting sun, Jack got down on one knee and held out the ring. Claire, radiant with happiness, immediately said yes. Their wedding was planned for the end of August, and the town began to prepare for it as a grand celebration. Claire bought herself a beautiful snow-white dress. Together with Jack, they chose the wedding venue. However, not everything was as wonderful as it seemed. Jack's mind began to change in ways he had never told anyone about. He found it increasingly difficult to imagine himself bound by the bonds of marriage. Responsibility was weighing on him, and the fear of losing his freedom began to torment him from within. The influence of his two best friends, Tom and Billy, contributed to this. Both were inveterate bachelors and disapproved of his friend's hasty decision. They convinced him that getting married was a mistake, that Claire was too clingy, and that life was just beginning. One day, after a loud party, Jack, completely lost in thought, told his friends that he was going to break off the engagement. The night before the wedding, Jack, barely able to stand on his feet from alcohol, called Claire on the phone. His voice was cold and alien. "Claire, I can't marry you." "What? What did you say?" Her voice trembled. "I'm sorry. I don't want this wedding. I don't love you. It was all a mistake." Claire told him, "I'll wait for you." Claire couldn't believe her ears. Something inside her snapped. It was like being stabbed in the heart. The next morning, when her parents went into her room, they found her lifeless body hanging from the chandelier in her wedding dress. Tears, hysteria, and shock came over the family and the town. Claire's death shocked everyone. The town was in mourning. Jack, feeling guilty, didn't know where to put himself. Her last words echoed in his head. "I'll wait for you." Those words began to haunt him. After the funeral, he decided to get out of town to get his mind off things. Together with Tom and Billy, they traveled to an old country house that belonged to his family. The house had been abandoned for years, surrounded by thick woods, and was far away from people. They hoped to spend a couple of days there, forget about everything, and go back to their normal lives. When night fell, strange things began to happen. At first, they thought someone was walking around the house. The sound of footsteps was quiet, almost imperceptible, but they all heard it. Then, the doors began to slam shut on their own, and the windows swung open, even though there was no wind outside. Billy, being the most superstitious, was the first to speak. "Boys, this isn't a joke. There's something wrong here. I'm going home." He left the house and headed for the car. A couple of minutes later, Tom and Jack never heard the car start and drive away, but Bill did not return to the house. The next morning, Jack and Tom found his body hanging from a tree, just like Claire. That afternoon, the horror intensified. Left alone, Jack and Tom guessed that something inexplicable was happening to them. They were afraid to leave the house, looking at Bill's body hanging from the tree. They couldn't leave in the car either, as Bill had taken the keys. In the evening, Claire's ghost began to appear to them in different places in the house. First it was a mist, then a barely visible female figure. Jack closed his eyes and began to think about how they could get out, and felt a cold kiss on his lips. He opened his eyes and saw her, pale in her wedding dress, with a twisted face and empty eyes filled with hate. "I told you I'd wait for you," she whispered. He tried to scream, but his voice froze in his throat. Claire raised her hand, and Jack felt his body clench in pain, as if an unknown force was choking him from the inside. He tried to struggle, but it was no use. At the last moment before his death, before his heart stopped, he realized that he would not be able to escape from it. A few days later, the boys' relatives started looking for them. When they arrived at the abandoned house, they saw Bill's body hanging from a tree. They called the police. When they entered the house, they found Jack's body lying on the floor. All his ribs were broken, as if he had been crushed by something big and very strong. Tom was found dead in the basement of the house. His body was mutilated, as if he had been tormented by a pack of wolves or wild dogs. However, the presence of animals in the house was never detected by the police. The house in the woods has quickly become a place surrounded by terrible rumors. At night you could hear horrible screams and whispers, and sometimes the white figure of a bride would glimpse out of the window of the house. All the inhabitants were afraid to go near there. The town of Marble Ridge remembered the story of Claire Matthews forever. Her tragedy was whispered about for years, and newlyweds often left flowers at her grave so that her spirit would not disturb them. However, from time to time, young boys disappeared in the neighborhood of the abandoned house, and no one doubted. Claire is still waiting for her fiancé.